sentence? Well, the origins of the life sentence actually lie in ecclesiastical courts. As you know, for most serious crime in Europe, say in the Middle Ages and up through the early modern period, as we've reviewed, there was the death penalty, and then there was a kind of host of either symbolic or sort of physical punishments short of death, like being put in the stocks or flogged or ear cropped, or sometimes the branding that went on the thumb that went with a benefit of clergy, something that also had its origins in ecclesiastical courts. There was virtually no punishment of people being locked away in something like a prison for a very long time or life. People would be held in jails pending their trials, sometimes for a brief period of time, like a few months, pending their execution or their transportation if they had been spared the gallows. But by and large, there was no practice of punishing people for serious crimes by locking them up. There were, as we'll see starting next week when we study the birth of the prison, there were analogies that people could look to, things like the French chateau that were the place where you were taken and there was a lettre de cachet issued by the French crown against you, usually because you were the wayward daughter or son of a noble family whose behavior was bringing shame to your family. You'd be locked away in the chateau, so it wasn't too harsh. Still, your freedom was taken away. But there was not a practice of punishing people, certainly not for life, for serious crimes. The place this emerged, though, as a punishment was in the church. Under church doctrine, the church could not execute somebody. In the sense, the church was opposed to the death penalty from the very beginning. Of course, it didn't stop them from handing over Joan of Arc to the English to execute her, so they were certainly capable of executing people or seeing them executed. But by and large, the clergy and the church, I should say, did not use the death penalty, and its clergy were subject to the church unless they were stripped of that status. So when a clergyman, I guess they were all men in those days certainly, and I guess still in the Roman church, committed a very grievous capital crime like rape or murder, they would essentially receive a life sentence in a monastery. They would be sent to one of the holy monasteries in Europe and put in whatever the lowest level of monkness was and spent, in theory, the rest of their lives seeking penitence in that setting. In some ways, this is both the first life sentence and the first life sentence without parole, because it's not quite clear, to my knowledge, if and how people were ever released from that. On the other hand, it wasn't quite prison either. It was an ongoing ecclesiastical religious institution that you were part of. Now, the life sentence became a much bigger deal in terms of public policy when Beccaria, in the 18th century, put on the agenda the idea that the death penalty could be eliminated and replaced with life imprisonment. And he kind of said that as if, like, everyone had always known there was such a thing as life imprisonment. But in fact, there were no prisons really around the time that he said, well, let's replace the death penalty with life imprisonment. So what did he have in mind? The most likely thing he had in mind is slavery. He probably imagined that if the people sentenced essentially to life imprisonment under his alternative to the death penalty would be put in perpetual servitude or slavery. Now, in Beccaria's time, in the 18th century, slavery was highly associated in Europe with the Caribbean plantations. Not so much yet with the American style of chattel slavery, in which slaves essentially were reproduced and accumulated. It was a different model in the Caribbean. By and large, slaves were worked to death. Between the climate, the various infectious diseases, and the incredibly arduous work involved in sugarcane and other kinds of production in the Caribbean, your life as a slave was not a long one. And after 5 or 6 or 7 years, you were very likely to be dead. So in some ways, life imprisonment was not a very long time, as Beccaria would have imagined it. And he thought, and from that point of view, it maybe seemed less surprising to you that he thought it would be an equally good deterrent or better deterrent to the death penalty. Certainly being worked to death in a hideous plantation setting might not compare terribly favorably to a hanging. So the real life as we think of it today, which is being sent to a prison type of institution to spend some lengthy period of time, potentially meaning the rest of your life, or if you don't get the benefit of various release mechanisms the rest of your life, really came into play in the 19th century with the development of penitentiary prisons, the first of which was built began right in the 1820s in Philadelphia. Shortly thereafter, there was a prison at Auburn in New York that became a very popular design model. We'll study these prisons in depth in the next couple of weeks. They relied on forced labor, so they had some element of slavery to them, but they were a bit more like factories than plantations, although as we'll see, the South had plantation-style prisons. In any event, it's not quite clear what, as states began to adopt in the United States, life imprisonment as an alternative to the death penalty. It wasn't so clear what that really meant. Did they really think people would be sent to the penitentiary and die there? Whatever they thought, it's pretty clear that that didn't happen. By and large, everywhere, as they do to this day, governors maintained the power to grant clemency, a leftover of the royal prerogative of pardon that the English crown had held. And throughout the 19th century, if you dig down into the archives of state governors, a lot of the business crossing their desk are exactly these petitions for clemency. You've got lots of people on the side of the prisoner, their family, maybe townsfolk who are urging the governor to exercise clemency. Sometimes you have the victim's family or the sheriff or others lobbying against it. But in any event, we know that it was often given. It's not that people didn't sometimes die in prison. They often do even without a life sentence, especially in California's difficult health delivery circumstances. But the difference is that when they were handed a life sentence, few of them would have expected that meant they had to die in prison. They might die in prison. They didn't have to. By the end of the 19th century, penal reformers thought that the life sentence was a great idea if it was tied deliberately to the idea of indeterminacy. That is, you could serve the rest of your life in prison, but if you work diligently at the kind of rehabilitative program we're going to offer you, you have the hope of release. This is the kind of argument that Zebulon Brockway was one of the great proponents of this kind of indeterminate sentence made. He imagined himself talking to a murderer or some other serious criminal. John Doe, you have wickedly broken one of the just and necessary laws of society. You must be shut up in prison and remain there until you give evidence that you are a changed man and can safely be permitted again to enjoy your freedom. Society has no resentments to gratify. We will give you every chance to recover yourself. Nay, more, we will help you. But you must work with us until you show, to our satisfaction, that you can be restored to freedom without loss of safety, I think it's meant to say, to the community. Your imprisonment must continue. And if you never give us such satisfaction, then you will never be discharged. Your imprisonment will be for life. So you can see that with the indeterminate life imprisonment sentence, there's a possibility that you'll die in prison, but that's supposed to be the exception, and which will motivate you to the rule of getting released. This was so popular in the eyes of some reformers who looked, for instance, to the model of a mental hospital or the asylum. Right? We do not set the madman free until he is cured of his madness. Neither can we safely or even justly set a criminal free until he is cured of his propensity to crime. And the idea was, why not apply this to all kinds of criminals? It might not even limit it to murders. And indeed, California, by the 1940s, did have an indeterminate sentence in which almost all felonies in which a prison sentence was given, that sentence was indeterminate. So you could get essentially you had a 2-year to life sentence, or 6 months to life sentence if you committed a burglary or robbery. Reality, of course, is that the parole was the important part of that. Social scientists, here's Robert Park and Ernest Burgess, who were University of Chicago sociologists in the 1900s, 1910s, and 20s, who were major proponents of the idea that with the aid of social science, prisons could assess the the threat to public safety that individual prisoners posed and decide whether or not to release them on parole. And indeed, the state of Illinois became the first state to appoint an official statistician to essentially do risk assessment of prisoners. So in this era, and here's Herbert Wechsler, who was a leading law reformer, criminal law reformer in the United States in the mid-20th century. The basic model that became pretty much universally adopted across the United States, and most other countries followed a similar path, was that when you were convicted of a crime like murder and were not sentenced to death, you received either a life sentence or a term of years, like 50 or 60 years, but with the expectation that you would receive both treatment while in prison and that you would be paroled. Now, often the treatment never materialized. That is, prisons didn't really have some wonder drug that they could give people that made them somehow recover from all the life deficits that had led them eventually to prison to start with. But they did get parole. By and large, prisons couldn't operate overcrowded, so prison managers needed parole, states needed parole, people came out. And this was the norm. In California in the 1970s, somebody convicted of first-degree murder but spared the death penalty was eligible for parole after 7 years and could expect to be paroled in under 10. And this was true for even some of the most infamous murders of the 20th century. So Nathan Leopold, one of the Logan Leopold, the murder pair, two young, quite brilliant college students. They were actually teenagers, but college students at the University of Chicago who murdered a neighboring boy on a kind of thrill kill, one of the many crimes of the 20th century in the 1920s. Their lives were spared after Clarence Darrow gave a spirited defense in which he basically pled them guilty, but then put on tons of new social science kind of evidence to try to show that these boys had committed the crime because of biological and psychological defects and could be eventually cured or at least contained. Here's actually one of the kind of phrenological pieces of evidence that they put into the file. It's a picture of Nathan Leopold, who was a teenager, as you can see, and showing various features of his physiognomy that suggest kind of criminal causation. He had a feminine nose and a sensuous lips, overdeveloped thyroid gland. I'm not, obviously, modern science has not verified these kinds of assumptions, although today we're probably more closer than ever to finding true brain disorders that may connect to at least some crimes. In any event, I put that out there only as an example of one, how young Leopold was, but also that this was an age where when the idea of not executing people meant that you also anticipated that you would release them eventually because you viewed them as to some extent malleable, changeable. Their violence was produced by certain causes and might be changed. And indeed, Leopold, who became kind of a poster child for rehabilitation, he was already one of the smartest people on the planet in terms of his IQ, but he applied himself diligently in prison, taught lots of prisoners to read and write, volunteered for medical experiments, developed his own approach to curing several tropical diseases and things of this nature. And he eventually won parole in I think it was the early 1960s. He served something like 35 years before his parole. Here you see him as a sort of middle-aged adult in prison. Just yesterday, I noticed in the New York Times had an obit for a very similar alarming murder episode that took place again in Chicago, my hometown. I don't remember this one. Of course, it happened in 1945, but I do remember because I think it's been popularized by some films. In this case, there was a series of grisly sex murders, including the dismemberment of a little girl whose body was found in a basement. And in one of the crime scenes, the killer had written with lipstick on the mirror, "For God's sake, stop me before I kill again." I think that has been used in some movies over the years as kind of a popular, certainly a scary concept. In any event, their investigation eventually led them to a man named William Hirons, himself actually a teenage, very youthful University of Chicago undergraduate. Maybe it's something about the University of Chicago. I grew up around there, so take that with a grain of salt. But in any event, he always maintained his innocence. The point being, he died just the other day, and I put his obituary on BSpace after serving some 65 years in prison. So the idea that you would serve the rest of your life in prison isn't a wholly new thing, clearly. Here's an example of one. He obviously went to prison about 20 years after Nathan Leopold. His crimes arguably were worse because he killed more people, and he had 3 consecutive life sentences. But it might be that, but for the kind of changes that have made America more punitive since the 60s, he might have gotten released sometime in the 70s or 80s. Now again, he maintained his innocence throughout his life, and that's a difficult position from a parole point of view because the parole board definitely wants to see evidence that you're remorseful, that you understand the reasons for your crime, that you're not going to do it again. And if your bottom line argument is I still didn't do it, and they don't believe you, then it's kind of hard to say that you're remorseful or you've learned the lessons of your life. In any event, point of this part of the lecture is that while we've had a life sentence or the concept of a life sentence for a very long time, up till now it has never meant a life without parole sentence. Even though occasionally people have been given so many life sentences that in fact they did not get out of prison and died there. So what's driving this growth of life without parole? And here, let's take a moment to sort of draw on our social theory toolkits to ask some questions, at least ask some questions about what's driving this, even if we don't know if we can answer them yet. So a Durkheimian scholar of punishment society might say, well, if there's a new penalty, it usually reflects new values, or the fact that an old penalty that had long served the role of addressing certain kinds of crimes or certain kinds of events has fallen out of favor with values and therefore needs to be replaced, presumably with a penalty that is more compatible with values. So putting on your Durkheimian cap for a moment, or sort of dialing Durkheim up on your iPod, whatever metaphor you would like for thinking this through with me, what kind of values in American society over the last 20 or 30 years, which is the period in which we've seen LWOP go up, might explain the adoption of a new sanction that really didn't exist before, along the lines of life without parole? What is life without parole? If you're looking at it as a Durkheimian anthropologist and kind of saying, well, what values seem to be embodied not only in this sentence, but in the way it has replaced other sentences like the death penalty or like life with parole sentences? That's an interesting observation. I mean, for Durkheim himself, of course, it was the rise of social science and kind of a more deterministic view of how people's behavior was shaped that went along with what he thought of as the leniency development in penal evolution. And so, but that's apropos that for us, or at least in recent decades, we may have seen the decline of that value, the deference, if you will, or confidence in experts, and simultaneously the rise of a more populist sensibility about what's appropriate, right? It's not only that we don't trust the social scientists, I think that that's true, right? But we also think it's not just the social scientists who we ought to listen to, it's people like the victim's family, police officers or correctional officers who have contact with criminals and who have tended for their own reasons to be very supportive of life without parole, certainly if they don't have the death penalty to fall back on. So I think that's an interesting observation that LWOP reflects a value of skepticism about experts and also a great deal of identity with and sympathy with ordinary people and victims especially. Yes?
I was going to say just the availability of information about people and their history and recidivism. We're a lot more aware now, like it's more publicized violent crimes. There's usually some element of, oh, and look what this person did 10 years ago. We have records of what people are doing, so there's less of a belief, same in line with the previous response. There's less of a belief that people can change.
I think that's a good point. And we can think of it from a Durkheimian point of view, in a sense, as a value. We want to think of it as a value. We might think of that value as one of guaranteeing the security of the public, right? Obviously, public safety has been part of the justice system for a very long time. It wasn't so much a part of the justice system if you go back to the scaffold, right, where it's kind of the king's security that's more concerned. But certainly one of the modernizing trends is the focus on public safety, and certainly incapacitation. The idea that only, if you're not, especially if you're not going to have a life sentence, I'm sorry, you're not going to have a death sentence, that only a guaranteed, hard, guarantee that the person's not going to be considered for parole can assure you that people who don't change, who are threats, and Charles Manson, I think, both as a particular example, and also perhaps historically as a popular example of somebody whose crimes seemed very much to demonstrate this lack of change, the fact that he could be dangerous and capable of influencing people over a great deal of time, right? If Manson, who led his followers to commit murders without even having to be there, could do that then, the fact that he's now an old man doesn't necessarily mean that he's not dangerous, right? So as an example, he's provides the kind of picture you're talking about of an unchanging threat. And so, the value here, think of it from the point of view of values, what we can see here is a positive value, identification with victims, and a strong kind of moral imperative to make sure that victims are protected even against relatively small risks, right? Because when you started to say what people know about recidivism, as we'll come back to at the end of this lecture, people don't really know much about recidivism. They've heard that, what they know is that a particular person who's committed a heinous crime was in prison before. What they don't know is how many other people out there who were in prison for that same crime are now, vacuuming their pool or, teaching your punishment in society class. And so I wouldn't want to say that people have a kind of scientific knowledge of recidivism. But what they do have is what you might call a common sense about recidivism. And that common sense is that people don't change, and that if people are bad and dangerous, they're likely to remain so. A Foucauldian asked typically about a new penal sanction like life without parole. How does it produce truth and power? How does it bring new forms of truth out from the body of those under punishment in ways that benefit or at least feed into existing structures of power? So we saw that tormenting the body of the condemned on the scaffold fit into a whole sort of technology of infusing monarchy with majesty, terror, excitement, etc. Can we think about LWOP as a regime of truth and power that is set up around the bodies of prisoners? Does that give us any purchase on what it might represent, where it might come from, or what might explain its salience and acceptability today in our society? Well, in a way, I think often our theorists, the questions they ask produce observations that overlap here, right? So, is there an image, is there a truth that is produced by LWOP? In a way, there's an absence, right? I mean, the thing that makes Charles Manson in some ways so well known, I guess, is partly obviously the notoriety of his crimes. It's also partly the fact that he comes up for parole every 7 years. So every 7 years, there's another round of newspaper articles about whether or not Manson will get out. Now, at this point, nobody's biting their nails because he's been denied 40 times or whatever since, not 40, but many times since 1972, and his death sentence was turned to a life sentence. But the point is that what LWOP does from the point of view of people in power is prevent a message going out that this dangerous, scary person might get out of prison, and that it's totally dependent on people who you have no control over, parole board members that are probably university professors or other people we really don't trust to protect our kids or ourselves. Marxists would ask, sort of any sanction, what role does it play in the larger equilibrium of an unequal society? How does it maintain the balance of the unequal balance of power? And so from a Marxist point of view, we might think about who gets LWOP to begin with. Is it a tool to eliminate people that are viewed as particularly threatening, either directly to authorities or more to the kind of legitimacy of government? And I think one of the things, although race has not been raised directly in the appeal to the Supreme Court, I think the evidence would show that there's definitely a racial skew in terms of who ends up with LWOP sentences, especially juveniles. And indeed, in addition to the sort of Charles Manson, who's a good example of kind of poster child for LWOP, who's still a poster child when he's 80, right? Because he kind of represents a Svengali-like scariness that isn't dependent on youth. But in the 1990s, the very period where this LWOP increase began, we also had a kind of concern that was spread actually initially by some criminologists who normally don't get listened to, but in this case they were emphasizing things that already fit with popular public assumptions about how scary criminals were. And this was the idea of super predators. Back in the early 90s, John DiIulio, who was a very well-known criminologist, he ultimately served in the Bush administration, wrote a book called Body Count, I think, in which he claimed that a generation of sociopathic teenagers was sort of coming up in America who raised on MTV and drugs or whatever, basically would kill and remorselessly and wouldn't really respond to deterrence, certainly couldn't be rehabilitated, and that the murder rate would skyrocket. Now, you all know now from when we looked at the crime decline that just when he was predicting that, the murder rate was actually beginning to go to an historic nosedive. So the generation of people he stigmatized as super predators turned out to be much less predatory than their predecessors as a cohort. Nonetheless, this image, again, you might ask, how can a 14-year-old get a life without parole sentence? Well, the answer is sometimes the younger they are, the scarier they can be. Youth is also scary to especially middle-aged people like me who tend to fill out juries, right? And you'll remember, even in Roper versus Simmons, you may remember that in the court summary of the prosecution of the teenager in that case, when the issue came up before the death penalty jury as to whether his youth ought to be a mitigating circumstance, the prosecutor said, it's an aggravating circumstance. I mean, imagine what he'll be like in a few decades if he's this vicious, essentially now.